Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week, you'll hear a conversation with Bam and Ro, two residents of so-called Durham, North Carolina, to talk about that city and industries and their experience in solidarity with houseless neighbors, particularly in the Oakwood Park encampment, which the city has already attempted to evict once this year. The guests give a long-term and detailed view of the development of the city and the role of Duke University and the adjacent co-constitutive businesses of Duke, the city's Triangle Research Park, and the roles that they play in the day-to-day grind of living in that Triangle city. Check the show notes for a GoFundMe to support mutual aid in the Oakwood community. Also, after the interview, the guests reached out and wanted to give an uplift to Traingle Anarchist Black Cross as one group involved in community support for the Oakwood Park encampment. And finally, many of the people listed in as inspirations by Ro at the end of the interview have been either guests of the show or the subjects of past episodes, and you can find those via the tag Black Anarchism.
Thank you for having us. My name is Ro. I am located in what's called the Triangle area of North Carolina. I moved through lands that have been stewarded by the Eno, Okanichi, Tuscarora, Lumbee, to name a few of the indigenous people of this land. So that's kind of how I view my area. And as far as affiliations, I am affiliated with the Oakwood Park unhoused encampment and all the people who fight for liberation.
And my name's Bam. Use he, him pronouns. Location located in the Triangle area as well, but mostly based out of, when it comes to organization, based out of Durham. And as for affiliation, also affiliated with the Oakwood Park encampment for the unhoused, and then a few political prisoner support groups and some other general organizing work in the area as well.
Thank you both so much for taking the time to have this chat. I wonder if you could tell the audience a bit about the Triangle, but in particular about Durham, about the landscape, the economy, like who lives there, what living there is like.
Yeah, I guess more generally, Durham itself is a supposedly thriving, growing city. One of the so-called like Black-run, Black-financed cities, similar to Atlanta and Memphis and other cities around the country. Durham is a place where people have, a lot of pride in the history of Black prosperity, of Black success, and the historical Black Wall Street that was in the center of downtown Durham. There's a lot of pride that people have in that. And more generally, economically, Durham is run almost entirely by Duke, that corporation and university. They control and own almost the entirety of the city. They run a lot of the healthcare and things like that that impact everybody generally. So it is Duke City in a lot of ways, even though there is a pride in the Black ownership and Black business guidance, Black success that has been almost entirely funded by white capital and white business. And Durham itself, when it comes down to like demographically, is proposed as a super Black city, but there is almost, of course, like everywhere, a minority of Black people. And the economic disparity amongst everybody is very, very, very large, where the inequality between those that have and those who do not have is widening almost every single day. And Duke as a corporation influences that, and they pretty much have the entire city in their hands. And with the assistance of politicians and the enforcement by the police and any other state militia, they are allowed to continue to own and control property, own and control the means of life and survival on an everyday basis. And then, on the ground, the city itself does the bidding of those corporations and allows for them to come in and, plunder and destroy and take down the wildlife and the trees and plant life across the city to build these brand new very ugly developments and housing projects that serve only those that have the ability to afford them.
Thanks, man. That was really thorough. I think the piece that I'd like to add is a little bit of the history of Durham to give some context as to how this pattern that BAM detailed presents. As I mentioned, there are many indigenous people that steward the land that is now considered or called Durham. And they actually did the work of making it a place of commerce, of community, of a lot of trade and life. And with the settling of European colonists, or you can call them colonial settlers, they kind of take over and infiltrate and invade that space and start to build their own settlements and upon that. And as we know, we get the development of plantations in the region because of how fertile and rich the land is. And it is of importance to know that Durham is the locale for Stagville Plantation, which was one of the largest plantations in the South during the earlier years of the settler nation. So that's important to keep in mind. And Stagville Plantation enslaved about 900 Africans. That is what is documented or understood. And after the Civil War, the majority of those Africans migrated off the plantation and settled their own communities like Hayti and Bragtown. And as far as how those people lived in the period after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, they actually continued some of the same work that they were doing on the plantations. So the cash crop of North Carolina is tobacco, and the Durham area sold a lot of what is called bright leaf tobacco, which is a type of tobacco that has a particular curing process. But the enslaved Africans were procuring this tobacco and doing the labor of processing it while on the plantations. During the migration of these people off the plantation, some of them are sharecroppers, still managing those lands. And then as the quote unquote city of Durham grows, tobacco becomes the place where wealth is built. And that is actually how the Duke family garnered its wealth, through tobacco and building the American Tobacco Company. And you'll see that throughout downtown Durham. You'll see like the Lucky Strike Tower, because that was one of the companies it acquired in making the American Tobacco Company. And the African people that are living in the communities that are now making up Durham worked in these factories, tobacco factories, and they worked in subpar conditions. So you kind of see the continued pattern of like exploitation of people and the flow of wealth in one direction, and specifically enslaved people, and the erasure of Native people. And that is a process that is continued to this day. So I just want to kind of highlight that history because I think it's like really important. And also knowing that Duke is such a huge fixture of Durham, and understanding that the Duke family got their wealth from the tobacco industry. So,
yeah, that's super powerful. Thank you for laying that out. And I guess because it's come up, it's going to continue coming up in the conversation. You were talking about like the accumulation and extraction of capital by these white elite, and oftentimes like with the same like literal lineage, same family running endowments and corporations and farms, plantations. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of industries, I guess, that Duke is involved with now? Because there's clearly the university. It's a very well-known university. There's a bunch of hospitals, right, that they run. And I imagine that they're pretty tied into the research.
The research triangle, yeah. The park, yeah.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, if there's other elements or like how these industries impact the people who live in and around Durham, bring like housing costs or job availability, like that sort of stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ben, do you want to answer that first? Or?
Yeah, sure. So I'll say that Duke, they have, I guess, their hands in a lot of different things I've already mentioned when it comes down to their involvement in healthcare, owning the two largest hospitals in the city that have a lot of traffic for the housed and unhoused. But also, Duke Energy is like the primary energy corporation or functioner in the city, and they are constantly raising prices and jacking up, costs for those that are housed. And it has been a constant issue that residents who have been mobilizing people have had to fight for to challenge the constant price hiking. But generally for like healthcare, I think that Duke has their hand and their hold on that in the city, and they are able to, allow and disallow folks from having access to that. So a lot of the in-house folks, have had dealt with, physical, psychological ailments and issues that they're dealing with still to this day, and they all have to go through Duke. So everything flows through, this large, super giant corporation. But I guess what I'm going to understand Duke Energy and the healthcare system, and also like different aspects of the everyday life that people live is controlled by Duke. And because they have the ability to unhouse and displace people, to raise prices whenever they see fit, there's a constant process of challenging Duke, conceding to Duke, things like that that the community has to go through because of how much control they have over pretty much everything in general, every aspect of life itself in the city.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add to Bam's pretty complete response is understanding like the Research Triangle Park, which is a huge fixture of Durham. So it's like this 7,000 acre plot of land that was selected and has been worked on for decades since like the 1959, so 1960s. And it was a region of development that was kind of curated by the local government, state government, Duke, other universities, local businesses. And the point was to kind of make it a place of investment and I guess kind of like future development of various pharmaceuticals and technology, making it a hub of sorts within the United States. And in that capitalist endeavor, they were very successful because the Research Triangle Park, which is, if you look at the region, it's enveloped by Durham on three sides and is extended into like Wake County. But that park is the most prominent research science park in the nation. And that park also houses about like 300 different companies, IBM being one of the earlier investors. But it's important to keep that in mind because that is like a jewel of the city. And so the point is to always make the city alluring to investors for those who desire to accumulate capital, right? And I think one of the things that the city's like really proud of, and those who are part of the Research Triangle Park, is that AbbVie, which is like a pharmaceutical company, they recently announced they would be investing $1.4 billion to bring a campus to Durham. And so with that kind of massive investment, with the focus on developing that research triangle, which has produced some novel drugs that are very important to day-to-day life for many people, you have the focus being on building a city that feeds the work, that provides workers for that park. And so from there, you're going to get this great hostility towards the unhoused, but also the acknowledgement that within a capitalist economy, those who are unhoused are always required. You need that kind of population of like free labor to do free or low, very low wage labor to do the quote unquote undesirable work that will eventually outflow from a region that has so much investment there for tech and pharmaceutical companies. I guess I wanted to end that by saying it's important to understand the Research Triangle Park in its relationship to Durham, and also understanding like Duke University is one of the key investors in the city of Durham. So this relationship is very like, it's almost linear to an extent. So, yeah.
The National Lawyers Guild Federal Repression Defense Hotline is live and ready to help you assert your rights. Did you know you have no obligation to speak with law enforcement or let them in without a warrant? Instead, you can say, "I will not speak to police before consulting an attorney. Leave your name and number, and a lawyer will call you." If you are visited by federal agents or served a federal grand jury subpoena, call the National Lawyers Guild Federal Repression Defense Hotline at 212-679-2811 to have a free, privileged conversation about your rights, risks, and responsibilities, and to be connected to legal resources in your area. As the federal government targets people for their constitutionally protected beliefs and activities, standing up for your rights is more important than ever. The National Lawyers Guild Federal Repression Defense Hotline is here to support you at 212-679-2811.
So how does homelessness look there? Where are folks that are houseless on the streets of and in the parks of Durham from? What relationships do they have with their housed neighbors? And how do the city and university interface with houselessness in terms of like services or policing or allowable spaces, this sort of stuff?
I think homelessness in the unhoused community in Durham, we have understood it to be, the community within the community. Now, once you engage with folks, once you are, speaking with and talking to and trying to meet the needs of folks that are living outside, you enter like a community that's just within, dealing with all the aspects of the external, but, having their own way of moving, way of functioning, things that need to be done to survive to the next day. And we have, been observing just like the desperation of the condition. And that's what Durham, similar to most cities, has. Those who are unhoused, those who are always on that line of struggling, financially, the desperation that is bred from that. And, a lot of the unhoused folks are trying to create or trying to find some type of community. A lot of it can end up being very alienated, very individual, but at the end of the day, folks are looking for, general community. And, we have seen that as something that has always been present. I think that, when we talk about, I guess, like how the city interacts, there is a constant, hostility that is present between the city, between, folks that, are housed, that live on the direct exterior of the encampment that we, organize that. There's a constant hostility all around them, all around those who are unhoused. And the city utilizes, the enforcement of the police, to control and corral the unhoused, to imprison and to, displace them from, their created, almost carved out homes and spaces in which they lay their heads down. There's a constant hostility towards them for that. Homelessness in Durham is always greatly underestimated by the city. They have like these numbers they put out of, we have this many thousand people who are unhoused, this many hundred people in this area, that area. And the number can't ever really properly be, calculated because it's a constantly fluctuating condition. People are unhoused and housed almost back and forth. There's some, people that are always going to be on that line of not knowing if they'll have somewhere to stay at next month, next week, next year, and those that have, fallen out of being housed. So the city tries to calculate how many often to get a number to make their, bullshit plans on care and community. But, it's a condition that is just kind of ever changing and ever present. But there's never been, and there will never be, because of the functions of just the state in general, a way of addressing, that condition from the root of it. Of course, we talk about like root causes. There's always a straying away from tackling the economic condition that presents that. So, and I guess a summary is that like those who are unhoused are sprawled throughout the city, are some mainly concentrated in the downtown areas, and are in a constant battle of hostility with the city, just trying to find somewhere to sleep, somewhere to sit, somewhere to rest, especially now, in the summertime with this hot weather, being very unforgiving for those that are outside. But the city is almost hell-bent, dedicated to making life more difficult, than it already is. And, that's one thing that we've always understood, that the responses that those who are living outside have, the hostility, the lashing out, the expressions of emotion, just come from being in a constant state of hostility. The police here target the unhoused very often. They arrest and imprison, they, abuse and target the unhoused almost on an everyday basis. So with that, there's no further understanding that needs to be had or created to why folks feel so hostile, feel so alienated while they're living outside, because all they deal with is that condition. And the city has no intention of actually addressing that for real. There have been attempts to pretend to care, which I'm sure we'll get into a bit later, but it is always a constant level of hostility towards the unhoused communities.
And you're always giving such great overview and understanding. I think the piece that I want to add is that the unhoused, based on like Dan had stated, there's difficulty in figuring out like this actual quote unquote statistics, but it is documented in many city county reports that the unhoused population of Durham County is disproportionately Black. And obviously, that is not surprising when you understand the history of this anti Black settler nation, and also specifically the history of Durham. And I think it's not ironic, but I think the city uses its history of like a Black Wall Street as a way to disregard those Black people who cannot be part of the affluent, who cannot be part of quote unquote society. And it's funny because even that Black Wall Street back when it was first becoming what it is, so specifically like in the 1900s in the period of like Reconstruction, we have John Merrick who founds the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, which is the largest and oldest Black-owned life insurance company. And then you also have the creation of M&F Bank, which is a Black American owned and managed bank and one of the strongest in the nation. So you have this Black Wall Street that's developing at the time, but still that wealth, which is also allowed and funded by the wealthy white elite of the city. And you can look through the history and it will, documents will say that some of these people received some donations and endowments from white benefactors, or were even allowed to create these businesses because there were some white folk that thought, okay, this should be okay. This is within the purview of what we would accept, but that still leaves the majority of Africans, of Black people in the city dispossessed, working in those factories that I talked about, sharecropping, really struggling in even the domestic sector to make it by day to day. And so again, that history continues through the development of Durham to now you have, well, there's always been those who are unhoused, right? But in this current day and age, you see the population being disproportionately Black. And so very tied to the anti-Black history of the nation and the anti-Black development of the city of Durham.
With the Research Triangle, with the university, like the city has probably become harder to live in. I would imagine that the costs have been going up over the last couple of decades, as quote unquote, like gentrification ramps up as it has in so many places around the country, pretty much everywhere it feels like. And so that's probably been like that. And I would imagine the housing crisis, like it did everywhere in 2008, ended up being a moment, an event, or a series of events that had a terrible impact on, in particular, homeowners of color. But I'm wondering, does the city have a business improvement district that one got passed maybe a year ago in Asheville, and that's been, another layer of anti-Black, but also like class-based policing of the downtown business district. Does Durham have something like that? And what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so Durham has the DDI, or like Durham Downtown Incorporated. It's officially like a nonprofit organization, but they've had it for a while now. And for the past, I think like 20 or so years, they've invested like a few $1 billion in just kind of building and creating a thriving downtown area, with additional like adding businesses and creating new supposed opportunities for jobs and things along those lines. So they have like something similar to that And I think the institution of that kind of correlates with how, much more aggressive or aggravated the unhoused condition or the housing crisis has been. I think if I remember correctly, the Business Improvement District was founded in the 90s. And since that period of time, there has been a continuous growth in those that are unhoused. And I think that that, as I can understand, homelessness in that condition is a required aspect of any sort of expansion or development. I think that for capital to thrive, for capitalism to continue to exist, there needs to be a permanent, class of people who are always struggling. And the Business Improvement District added and aggravated that condition even more by continuously expanding, continuously plunging and destroying and deforesting land in the city to continuously build new businesses that hardly anybody even interacts with, but are just kind of there taking up the space, that are displacing people, forcing them out of homes, that is continuously, raising and jacking up prices of just the living conditions in general. Because while we are mainly organized with folks that are unhoused, we do also work with those that are housed, and they can attest to the fact that the price for their conditions of living have gone up so drastically, but there are also hundreds of businesses being opened almost every single year in the city, and that is of course directly correlated. But the condition of being unhoused is like a permanent requirement for that sort of expansion, because if there are those that are struggling, that are dispossessed completely, that have nothing, they always will have a supposed desire to get back or to gain something, to work, to labor. And as more businesses grow, of course, they need laborers for said businesses. And that's where the condition of being unhoused or the condition of intensified unemployment come into play, because then that permanent class of people will just always be struggling, always be on the edge of being unhoused or being unhoused quite literally, will always be able to be employed to work in these businesses that are ever growing.
So a kind listener sent me a couple of articles about the eviction and refounding of an encampment at Oakwood Park, and that happened in April of this year and May. And you both have mentioned it. So I wonder if you could talk about the encampment and what reasons the city is giving for why it's mounting these evictions, and what you think is behind it.
Yeah, so I think the project for the encampment itself comes from, I guess, more of a collecting of the individual asks of those that were unhoused in Durham or in the area of the encampment. Now, folks had reached out needing, immediate, medical support or healthcare support, and we were able to assist them in that at least as much as we could. And then being introduced to, the growing encampment at, Oakwood Park, was just kind of a side effect of being present to assist those individual needs. And as we were kind of working and getting used to that project, we were made aware of a sweep that was impending at the park in early April by the city workers and the police, and specifically the HEART program, HEART team, which I believe we could probably end up talking about later on, but they were also part of that initial attempted sweep. So being made aware of that, there was a decision to decide to defend, those that were there, and it kind of turned into this general project that we have now. But the city has constantly and consistently made encampments a public health safety hazard, or whatever they might call it, because they say that encampments are invasive to these public spaces. They will give you 1,000 reasons. There are needles on the ground, glass everywhere, people smoking. There are supposed public sex acts happening at the park. Whatever reason they can give to not only employ the police, but also employ the general surrounding housed community to the horrors of this encampment, supposedly. So they have given many reasons to why it needs to be evicted and cleaned out and, cleared out to allow for kids to come and use the playground and things like that. Which again, we can understand on being on the ground that none of these things are true, but there is a narrative battle they always are constantly engaged in on the city level to ensure that whatever they do can be properly understood by the general community, and the practice of it can be kind of turned away from and looked away from by the majority of the city. But they have not said, but the real reason, of course, is from what I can explain, the social aspect of what encampments mean for a city that is trying to grow in the way that Durham is trying to grow. There needs to be, a constant show of the city being in tip-top shape to show investors that this is, a place that is, ready and ripe for investment, for production, for expansion. And the existence of unhoused encampments is just something that cannot stand if the city is going to be given billions of dollars to build whatever business that will supposedly benefit the community or the city. So there's a constant process, a constant project to protect the image of Durham. And, with there being a new encampment almost every month now in the city of people who are just outside, who need somewhere to go and look for that sort of community on this small level, there's a project to remove and replace all of these encampments at some point down the line to protect that image of Durham being a thriving city that benefits everybody, yada, 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 whatever myths that they can come up with. So that's always been the project. And I think for most cities, and Durham is not unique in this, that the image of the city is everything when it comes down to business ventures, economic expansion, and more the general social understanding of a city and attracting people to move there, live there, or whatever else aspirations that the state has for these cities. The removal and clearing of encampments is a part of that process, because if we can plunge and imprison and kill, the dispossessed, the undesirables, then our city can be purely, for those that have, are removing those that do not. And, I think that like the efforts that we have been able to commit to and been somewhat successful in have challenged, just the bulldozing, literal and figurative bulldozing of encampments to disallow for these to just be cut and dry, to have to drag, the city out to fully show like why it is they're doing what they're doing. And not because we're going to confront them, on their grounds, but because the project of defense is one that will just kind of shed light on the truth of the condition and of the scenario that we're in, against the will of the state that tries to so often hide their true intentions.
I understand the encampments as necessary. People need a place to be, to rest, to live. And more often than not, people want to do that amongst other people and not be isolated. So the encampments develop as just a natural process of how people live. And as Bam detailed very astutely, the way in which those who are unhoused live is considered unsightly, but not of their own kind of causes, I guess. They're living in response to the conditions that have torn them away from their basic needs, and they are making do. So I think that is why they are there, and that is why they keep coming back. And the evictions are for the development of land that they may occupy that is now lucrative or appealing to developers that want to build new apartments for houses and apartments, to be honest, communities for ideal workers who can work in the Research Triangle Park or in the headquarters of certain pharmaceutical companies and tech companies that are in downtown Durham, right? So the unhoused become a nuisance in that regard, but they also are very important. Like the evictions of them is very important to the image, as Bam stated. And it's important to understand how the ability of the state and its police to move, corral, incarcerate, and harm people who have been marginalized by a capitalist economy. It is important for that process to look seamless, because that is a marker of how easily and how well the ruling class can accumulate their wealth, build capital, gain capital, and to continue to exploit. So it's a really disgusting kind of like display of what we can do, demonstrating that we have control of our city. We are able to create these borders firmly.
If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay, or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Willow Whisper for the intro and outro music. Check our show notes for a link to their SoundCloud. Can you talk a bit about the organizing that Houseless folks and their allies have engaged in terms of mutual aid and eviction defense?
Yeah, so I think the folks that we have been supporting have asked for, a multitude of different things, but more generally a holistic project that can combine meeting their needs while also, in the presence of, imminent danger, a threat by the city, by its police, and by its reformist organizations or whatever that it might be, that people are there to support. And, through the triaging of certain needs by the people, whether it is getting, comfortable things to sleep on or sleep in, to get clothes, to supply food and water, drinks and things like that, the needs of the everyday, that kind of became the project of defense, because it builds, a level of trust amongst the community to be able to rely on other people to get what they need, and also to create that need for themselves as well, to create the needs, the things that can meet that need. So, we have been kind of tasked with ensuring that there is a way of empowering people who are unhoused to supply themselves what they need to get through the everyday. And, results from that vary, of course, from trying to build a project like that to create some sort of autonomy within a space. It just takes time to build up the desire to do so. But the conditions, of course, still stay the same, still are desperate. And I think for more specific projects, there's some things, of course, that we'll just kind of keep as, internal things that we're trying to just kind of work through and do and commit to. But more generally speaking, like the combination of mutual aid and defense of the encampments and defense against sweeps and evictions is one that relies on a lot of trust, amongst us to come into, the living spaces of people who are living outside, to get what they need, bring what they need, and also to protect them when the time comes for that. Because while we haven't dealt with any specific, threats from the city, the time will always come back around. So trying to build in the meantime. But, the process of mutual aid, especially in Durham, the term mutual aid has been appropriated and perverted by many a nonprofit organization, by many people who desire to assist but don't have the actual political, ideological, commitments to maintaining that process. So for us, mutual aid meant, not only just supplying the material needs, but also trying to build an ideological support for that. And, it didn't take much for us to come in and say that, like, we don't with the police coming to try and evict people, and for folks to say, yeah, we don't either, but how do we do so? And trying to build up the, ability for them to do that themselves. And there's a commitment to the encampment, to being there, to being present. Folks don't just get up and leave. They're committed to being there because of what's being built. And that's just kind of through engaging in, methods of building that trust, from us and also amongst each other. And, the aspect of defense just kind of comes down to, like, there will be a physical presence whenever there is an attempt. And, the first attempted sweep that was thwarted was through a spontaneous, or I guess a gathering of people very, very last minute to defend the space. And then the second one, where folks, something's worth removed and thrown out, but within an hour of it, were brought back and set back up, was just through a constant commitment to making sure the remains there, it remains open, remains accessible to folks that need it. And it's been that way ever since. So I think that this combination of mutual aid and meeting needs and also defending when the time comes relies on the constant everyday process of building the trust amongst those who are housed, who are allied with the unhoused, and within the encampment itself, within the community itself, to rely on each other, to make sure you can trust the person that you're sleeping next to every single night, whether in the same tent or separate tents.
One neighbor of the park is quoted in a News Observer article from April saying that the park lacks the resources appropriate for people's needs, like running water, sanitation, etc. And it kind of puts the onus on not providing a permanent shelter on the city, like as the city's responsibility. And though this clearly is not the whole picture, because it's still looking at homeless people or houseless folks as a problem to be dealt with, as opposed to people living in a condition and a circumstance who have agency. It does touch on a point that I think gets lost in these conflicts, that cities often offer meager housing opportunities. They limit where people are allowed to exist, and they pit housed neighbors against their houseless ones, just hoping that the houseless folks will go away or disappear. And houseless folks' views and concerns get lost in the mix as if they're just shuffled from place to place or no place at all. So I wonder if you want to share anything about the sort of tensions that are built up between neighbors, the people that are camping in the park, and the city.
Yeah, in my time with the folks at Oakwood Park and seeing the dynamics between neighbors, between the city, I think it's very clear that the tensions are mounted in a very specific direction. And I guess simply put, it is the pig class versus the poor and the unhoused. And by the pig class, I mean those individuals who are not ruling class, but who are affluent, who what we may call like middle class or even poor, but align themselves with aspirations of becoming ruling class or engaging in all the societal and economic pathways and structures that allow the rich to be rich only simply for the ability to maintain a level of privilege above others. And so, in that regard, we have encountered those neighbors who make it their duty almost to surveil the encampments, to spread lies and disinformation in the avenues that the city has provided for them, meaning like the city council. Folks love going up there and saying how disgusting, off-putting, dangerous these encampments are. And that's kind of where the tensions build. So I think the dangerous part of that is that the individuals who I'll say like folks of the pig class, they rely on the police to handle their discontent, which puts those who are unhoused at greater risk for obviously destruction of their temporary homes and incarceration and death. But even with that kind of tension, we still have many, many people that understand that being homeless, being unhoused is not a foreign state or a condition, but it is merely an inevitable progression of one's own condition, living in the very, like, I don't even know how to describe the world that we're living in, but this very, like, hyper-capitalist environment where in order to live every day, you must work very hard for the majority of us, right? So even with those neighbors who make it their job to make the day-to-day life of those who are unhoused difficult and who choose to align themselves with the ruling class, there are many of us who are engaged in with the encampment, with the people there who understand that this is the condition in which we have been dealt with under capitalism. And we are committed to figuring out ways in which we can resist and strongly and firmly oppose the city, and all the state structures that make it so that we are constantly housing insecure or completely dispossessed.
I think that like when it comes to the relations between, the housed and unhoused, there is that, ideological or social separation between these two conditions. Even though, those that are housed some are not often too far off from being unhoused just because of the, unsturdiness or the insecurity of just being in these conditions, being poor, being, on the brink. There is still like state manufactured alienation and hierarchy being built, between those that have and those that do not. And it might not always be materially, real, but it is something that is mentally and psychologically embedded to where, those that, have a home, that have a job, that are working or are making some sort of money can always be secure in the fact that at least we're not them. Those that sleep outside, those that sleep on benches, that stay in tents, that are, in encampments. There's always that separation. And within that, it allows for people who do have to do everything they can to make sure they don't get to the condition, the deplorable condition of being unhoused. And that adds to the idea that the state that capital will always have people who are willing to work, to labor, to do whatever job, whatever occupation to make sure they have money, because there are economic implications for that, but also social implications to not wanting to fall down that ladder, to be completely dispossessed and displaced. So being willing to do whatever it takes to be, somewhere besides outside. And even those that we take care of that are in the encampment also have aspirations to be somewhere else. Most people, when you ask them what they want, they say they want a job, they want to work, they want to labor, and that's an understandable next step for the condition, but it's something that has been, put as the pinnacle of what people can do, of what people have access to, is when you work, when you have something that you get up and go and make money from every day. When you're toiling away for hours a week, that becomes the pinnacle. And, that condition, socially just creates and reifies the existence of the exploitation that, people face on an everyday basis. And, it's a condition, a psychological condition that we try to struggle against almost every day at this point, to challenge the psyche, understanding it is not something that is inherent, but something that is embedded into the minds of people, that live outside and our house as well. Something that has to be challenged as, not the final or last step to success or to prosperity, but something that has been proposed as, the primary way to be useful, or to be of use, to society.
So the city has worked alongside RTI, or Research Triangle Institute International, to create this project called Holistic Empathic Assistance Response Team, or HART, that has participated in some of these sweeps. And I think Bam mentioned HART before. Can you talk a little bit about what this is? Like, there was a project, I think, out of Eugene called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, that was meant to be a non-police emergency response. And I wonder if this is like started off as a sort of something in that vein. I mean, they're clearly working with police during these camp evictions. And can you talk a bit about a little bit more about the relationship between the university, the police, and this HART project?
I really want to pass this to Bam first, because he has some very really interesting and important things to say, and then I'll kind of go after that.
Yeah, so HART, and I'm not familiar with Cahoots, but I am familiar with the activity in Eugene when it comes down to the, eco activists, eco defense, organizers and movers over there. But HART, and more generally the Community Safety Department, was created in response directly to the 2020 uprisings. It was something that the state has signaled to the cities around the country to create some sort of reform, or to offer some sort of concession to people that were rightfully engaged in rageful rebellion across the country, in response to the constant, police killings and police activity in certain communities. So the Community Safety Department in Durham was created in response to that, to start the process of quelling that anger of the people. And in Durham specifically, there was a lot of activity, during those uprisings. So that was something that was almost directly created for that. And, HART comes around to function as, yes, the non-police, non-lethal emergency organization or force that is the alternative to police. They are beyond policing, from what some folks might say. And, they function in a way where they will tell you up front that we do not work with police. We have our own thing. We're here for you. We care for you, things like that. But through all practical and functional, activity, they do the exact opposite. And of course, it's clear with the encampments, because we see that they were active and present and telling people before the attempted sweeps that the cops were coming, that they were on the way to come and clear out the encampment. And it's showcased to a lot of the people who are staying outside the true function of HART. But we have been in a constant battle to delegitimize their existence, even though they've attempted so often to, reify their place in the city and then within the, unhoused population. They've infested a lot of different encampments with their activities, supposed, relocating and housing efforts. They try to create a place, a permanent place in the function of the unhoused on an everyday basis. But their true intentions, of course, were to be a part of that controlling and corralling system that the police and the city and the general state take part in and activate. And HART, has expanded their programs out to now they have systems or programs like the involuntary commitment program where they can just take someone off the street, kidnap them, and place them in Duke Hospital, who they have a partnership with for that program specifically, because they decide through whatever process that the folks that stay outside cannot make decisions independently. They must be made for them. And they've expanded out to these kind of projects as a direct combination and collaboration with the police, because they understand that there is such a anger and discomfort with the police coming and doing certain things that HEART becomes the replacement for that. And again, like, that is a direct reform response from the 2020 uprisings. And I think HEART has tried their best to distance themselves, but when you can clearly see that they are engaging with the police chief, talking to them during sweeps that are currently happening to discuss what needs to be done, they're giving messages from the police back and forth. The collaboration is clear and it's there. And then when you engage in that involuntary commitment program that takes folks off the street, and we have a very specific example of that from one of the folks that stayed in the encampment, you can see that the carcerality never leaves these kind of programs when they come from, the state's formatted reforms. It's always there. The capturing, the control, the ways in which they can just be kidnapped off the street is permanent in any, law enforcement force. And HEART exemplifies that as well. And they continue to do so. But now with, the more communal-based defense projects and assistance projects for the unhoused, they have kind of been rendered obsolete. But that project, at least for me personally, is still ongoing.
Thank you for that, Bam. I think the analysis that you have been building and as it relates to HEART is really important. Yeah, so thank you. I just want to add that they irritate me so goddamn much. Like, I just cannot stand the way in which they move, which is so like cowardly and so deceiving. They have this reputation that they're trying to build in regards to like making like announcements to certain people in the community who are considered like activists to say, hey, we're aware of the police planning a sweep on this day. And they feel very proud about that because they, are doing what the city told them to do. And they present themselves as a separate entity from the police in doing this kind of like, hey, just want to let you know, violence is coming your way. Please, duck and cover. If you need help ducking, well, I'll help you duck. But they make no effort. It's not their purpose, but they don't make any effort to stop the police, to counter the process or whatever decision makers saying that encampments need to be sweet. They don't actually intervene to say, hey, we have all this quote unquote affordable housing that we're building, but this is unrealistic. It's not affordable, right? People just need to be housed. We have all of these empty apartments, all of these empty buildings. What can we do with them? But no, their job is to make people complacent and comfortable with the violence that will be coming to them. And I think that is why I really despise them and they irritate the out of me. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and then I think I just wanted to add lastly that like HEART does come from the idea of an alternative to policing in Durham does come from a community demand that was created, around the time of the uprisings and the creation of the community safety department. Like, people in the community that were organizing then did advocate for a program that was different from the police. But what many of them and what we have, of course, understood is that when a demand is given to a city, or to a state, there's always a possibility for it to be co-opted to become something that benefits the state, but hardly ever benefits the people that made the demand. And that's what HEART became for a lot of people. And, I think that, with the institution of HEART, into almost the everyday programs of emergency response, it became at least formatted to what people wanted, an alternative. But when it gets, taken, the idea gets taken by the state, it becomes something that will always reify their existence. And that is something that the community didn't really want, but that's what it was given, and that's why the making of demands in that way always end up back in the same place as a concession being given and a co-optation, being, what infests all demands that people make.
Yeah, I don't think the state is never going to give up power, and so every demand to it needs to be taken with the expectation that you're going to get handed a snake and not like a handshake. Well, I've had you both on for a long time, and I really appreciate this conversation and all you've had to share. I just wanted to kind of close out with a question of what are some lessons that you take from the organizing that you've been engaged in and seeing going around homeless communities in Durham, and also if there are any groups that you want to uplift for support or further information from listeners in the audience.
Yeah, I'll start off here. I think as someone newer to this type of community organizing, the lesson I've gained so far is like organizing is not simply like just like lectures and webinars and reading all the books and knowing the how to quote so and so and in a debate. It is really the process of reading texts that are impactful. Like for me, I've been reading George Jackson, Kwesi Balagoon, Safia Bukhari, Russell Maroon Schultz, like reading the theory, reading the experiences, and then implementing that as I go into these communities, right? Because I see these people, as my family. So what I'm learning, I share with them, and we all try to figure out what praxis like works for us as far as like how will we move together as a unit? How do we deal with conflict? How are we honest with each other and what we can and cannot do? And so I've kind of understood like, oh, okay, I see what like Lorenzo and Janina Irvin were saying when it comes to like meeting the daily needs of the people. Like that is the organizing that will build, relationships and community, that builds a movement that is outside and inside, meaning like behind the walls and outside of the wall, making that connection is really like every day figuring out how we are going to build a new world right within what we're doing right now. And how do we actually share and spread what we are learning and like the understanding of our condition, and how are we going to determine that we deal with that, right? I think that's one of the greatest lessons. And within that, there's the recognition of it takes time. It requires patience. It requires a listening that respects what people are saying, the histories they may give you of themselves, of the place that they're in, of the city officials, politicians that you may not have even known, right? And then, just being honest overall. So hopefully that made sense, but that's kind of what I've been learning. It's been a beautiful process, very, very difficult. Nothing has been easy and nothing has been too beautiful in a sense of like, oh, it's just like, 1+1=2. The simplest 1+1=2 is like, I need some water. And you're like, great, I have some water for you. You know what I mean? But it's been very rewarding. And yeah, I think one thing I'd like to leave off with, so Michael Kimball, who is a Black gay anarchist political prisoner, has said that in the struggle for building a movement towards liberation, he's received a lot of joy in that. It's been hard, so hard, but it's the building of those relationships that make it worth it, and the change that happens that make it worth it. And so I'm like definitely seeing that.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing.
I mean, I can say what I learned, but it's not much more of a conclusion than that, for real. But I'll try to sum up. I think that, like, one of the main lessons that I've learned is that, a lot of organization or projects in our area and more in general tend to be very singular and individual. This project has taught me and has taught those that we work with, how necessary holistic organization is, how necessary it is to build holistic projects to meet all the requirements for communities. And we don't learn what these things are until we actually engage and discuss and decide. In working with the folks in the encampment at the park, we have been able to discuss certain history, certain theories, like Roy had explained, and reading with them, studying with them, the things that we read and we have studied, and talking about the concept of what it means to resist, what, a constant state of rebellion is, and how that when you are unhoused and you continue to, live every day and survive, you are in that state of rebellion. Just being conscious of that is the next step, and a lot of the folks do aspire for a lot of different things. They aspire to be liberated. They aspire to have somewhere to stay. They aspire to just take, what they need, and I think that is a very important aspect to what has, taught me, and being more, understanding, more open and more, just observant what the aspirations are. And then also learning that like nothing is inaccessible to those that are unhoused. None of the reading, none of the studying, none of the organizing tactics, nothing like that is inaccessible. It all just has to be shared. And we are in a struggle, in a project that is a walking and breathing and ever-changing archive, for our work. And it needs to be shared. It needs to be disseminated. It needs to be opened up so that we don't have just projects that are stagnated. We have projects that can develop and grow. And this project, has needed and will continue to need constant development and growth. And I think I'm excited to continue on and to push past where we're at now to get to something even greater than this.
I did neglect to say, I would encourage folks to please consider donating to the Oakwood Park Fund. We collectively use that money to get folks what they need every day: tents, water, food, fans, anything that they require. We use that money for that. So if people could donate, that would be greatly appreciated.
And yeah, no specific groups exactly that I can name. I think that I would just tell folks to just tap into the park if you're in the area. Even if you are a few hours away, there is work that is continuing on, that is growing every day in our city. And if there's interest in being involved, come find where people are at, come find what a movement is, and then, try to join, try to be a part of it in some capacity.
Yeah, it's awesome. People can't have too many comrades, so yeah, that's a good suggestion. Ro and Bam, thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it. I'll put a link to the fundraiser in the show notes, so folks should look at the post for this. And yeah, again, thank you so much for taking the time to share your experience and your wisdom.
Thank you.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero Network of Anarchist Podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hello and welcome to The Child and Its Enemies, a podcast about queer and neurodivergent kids living out anarchy and youth liberation. Here at The Child and Its Enemies, we believe that youth autonomy is not only crucial to queer and trans liberation, but to anarchy itself. Governance is inherently based on projecting linear narratives of time and development and gender onto our necessarily asynchronous and atemporal queer lives. And youth and teens are at the center of this form of oppression. Our goal with the podcast is to create a space by and for youth that challenges all forms of control and inspires us to create queer, feral, ageless networks of care. I'm your host, MK Zariel. I'm 15 years old, and I'm the youth correspondent at the Anarchist Review of Books, author of Debate Me Bro, and organizer of some all-ages queer spaces in my city and online. If you want to learn more or join us on Discord and Signal, our website is thechildanditsenemies.noblogs.org.
This is The Final Straw Radio. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville. Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.